Welcome back to the Reimaginers, a series where we turn to the past to explore how education has previously been reimagined, by whom, and for what purposes. As we continue to study the past for previous reimaginings of education, it's important that we think about schools in their totality, not just their prescribed curriculum and the way they invite students to learn, but also the ways schools prevent learning through systems of tracking, punitive disciplinary policies, or other discriminatory actions. While it is important to analyze how these systems work, it's equally important, if not more so, to listen to student voices. After all, their experiences capture the effects of these schooling practices. Moreover, student activists have historically provided powerful ways themselves to reimagine education. Today, we'll learn more about the Young Lords, a political organization led predominantly by poor and working class Puerto Rican youth who sought solutions for problems like garbage collection, the removal of lead paint from tenement walls, childcare, and more. The schooling experiences of these activists and their later mobilization of community education programs have the potential to expand our conversations about reimagining education in radical ways. Today, I'm once again joined by my co-host, Christina Martin. Hi, Christina. It's great to have you co-hosting again.
Hi, Matt. It's great to be co-hosting again.
To explore this history of the Young Lords, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Johanna Fernández. Dr. Fernández is an assistant professor at Baruch College. This past February, her powerful history documenting the evolution of the Young Lords was published by the University of North Carolina Press. And in addition to the publication of the Young Lords, Dr. Fernández directed and co-curated the museum exhibit Presente the Young Lords in New York. Dr. Fernández, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. And I'm an associate professor of history at Baruch College of the City University of New York.
So the first question that we have, can you just provide a brief overview of who the Young Lords were and how their experiences in schools helped shape their political development?
Okay, well, that is the subject of chapter 2 and 1 of the book. But the Young Lords are the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. The organization emerged as a street organization or gang in Chicago and was politicized and transformed into precisely that, the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party, through the leadership of the leader of the street organization, Jose Chacha Jimenez, but also with the intervention of Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. In New York, however, the Young Lords were composed of first-generation Puerto Rican college students, the first wave of people of color, really, Black Americans and Puerto Ricans, but also poor whites, who were admitted in large numbers to Columbia University, the City University of New York, Hunter College. And these were known as like college discovery programs that literally went out into the community to identify bright students who could form part of the first cohort of integrated sophomores or freshmen or juniors. And a part of what I argue in my book is that the Young Lords emerge in 1969 in New York at the height of the radicalization of the era, but they were organically radicalized through their experiences in the classroom with discrimination at the hands of teachers, but also in the context of the struggle to desegregate the public schools right here in New York. So when we talk about the desegregation of public schools, we mostly talk about parents who engaged in these struggles and teachers in New York who fought against, for example, the decentralization struggle, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville struggle. But we don't ever talk about how the experience of education in this moment of contestation influenced the consciousness of the children who were in the schools. In 1964, we see the largest civil rights struggle of the period when 484,000 students in the New York City public schools go on a one-day boycott. And this is at a moment when Black Americans and Puerto Ricans are becoming over 50% of the public school population. And at a moment when the growth of Black Americans and Puerto Ricans in the city is creating a white backlash. And increasingly, white parents are hostile to the notion that their children should sit alongside of Black and Puerto Rican, Black American and Puerto Rican students who were perceived to be slow learners, right? The ideology, the race ideology of the period suggested that that this would be terrible for white students. So there's this white backlash. And part of what I discovered as I conducted interviews was that the young lords as children had been confused and experienced this conflict had among adults as children. So they tell the story, some of them, of being bused to a school in Queens and seeing a fight break out, but also anti-busing demonstrations led by white parents. And they also tell the story of teachers saying horrific things to Puerto Rican students and Black American students in their presence, but also feeling that they were unfit because they spoke Spanish. So Spanish was banned from the classroom. So part of what I argue in that second chapter, which is about the desegregation of New York schools, or the battle to desegregate the New York schools, which failed miserably, as you all know from what the schools look like today, and its impact on the psyche and early radicalization, an organic kind of radicalization on these emerging radicals. There's more. It's a very, very complex and rich story. One of the developments is that as a result of that one-day boycott in New York City, in the New York City public schools, the parents had to figure out what the alternative instruction would be when the students were not there. And so what the folks I interviewed shared was that this was the beginning of an exploration of teaching students a history that would speak to them, like the history of W.E.B. Du Bois and slavery and what exactly happened during the Civil War and what was Reconstruction really about, but also what about the history of Puerto Rico and its relationship to the United States, and what about those who fought for Puerto Rican independence from U.S. colonial rule and Spanish colonial rule before then. So this was the very complex context within which young people as children are growing up. And then in 66, 67, part of what we see is a crescendo of student protest in the high schools and the beginning of a backlash on the part of administrators, principals, against unruly, uppity students of color, and the introduction for the first time of security guards in the New York City public schools in March of 1969.
Okay, I want to push on. You talked about the backlash of administrations and the administrators in the schools. Can you describe in more detail how the mentality of teachers, principals, and guidance counselors limited the opportunities of young people at that time, and how those imposed limitations shaped the way the young lords wanted to change education?
Well, part of what I suggest in the book is that, and not suggest, I discovered, is this introduction of law and order in the schools in reaction to student protest. So part of what the administrators and principals in particular argued was that there was a way to protest that was inappropriate, and an appropriate way to protest. Literally, speech was in many ways circumscribed by principals in a very paternalistic way within the framework of middle-class respectability, essentially. And so they literally draft these rules and write these memos in which they literally say that that protest is too unruly and disruptive, which is what protest is meant to be, and that they would not negotiate with it. And they literally say, discussion perhaps, maybe, negotiation never, with unruly students who are essentially attempting to stretch the boundaries of freedom in their schools and in the classroom, and their participation in the classroom, but also their ability to challenge the racism they experience from some of their teachers. But also they're trying to introduce ethnic studies curricula in the classroom. And this is not the Young Lords, this is what's happening in the high schools generally. What I discovered was also a rebellion on the part of track students of color to the institution of tracking, which they argued alienated them from the community and put them in a situation in which they experienced hostility from the predominantly white students with whom they were tracked. So it's fascinating, and part of what they argued was that that what mattered to them most was the process of education, not necessarily competition and a whole host of testing. So these are all issues that we are grappling with today. Not sure if I answered your question.
No, you got it.
I think building on that, you paint a clear picture of how schools radicalize those who later became the Young Lords, and, you know, kind of laid the groundwork for seeing education in a different way. And one of the things that's so striking in your book is when you document how the Young Lords were able to spread knowledge within the community and reach out to various community members and bring them together towards learning and collective action. I was wondering if you could just describe more of what that process looked like and how they were able to be so successful in those endeavors.
Well, I think part of what we see in the 60s is an experimentation with education through the War on Poverty programs. So there was a thing called the University of the Streets, which attempted to integrate into the classroom, an alternative classroom, young people who had been kicked out of the schools permanently. And some members of the Young Lords, like Denise Oliver, who was the first woman elected to the leadership body of the organization, and she was also African American, she worked in one of these alternative schools and had some level of success. Part of what is fascinating about the period is that the Young Lords are very young. These are college students, hadn't graduated yet. And I think that their proximity to the young people they were attempting to influence in terms of age had a huge impact on the learning process. So peer-to-peer education, we know, is incredibly effective. We learn more from our peers in college and in the lower grades than sometimes we learn from our teachers. That's like proven. So the Young Lords had that experience before they became Young Lords, some of them, not all of them. Certainly Iris Morales, through her educational work and organizing around tenants associations, they were leading public conversations at the local level. So part of what the Young Lords do effectively, I think, is that they produce a paper, right, which demands a certain consistent level of cogency, skills in writing, organization, artistic, visually, and that becomes in many ways a forum for learning, just the production of the newspaper. They also host a series of local meetings, which they call political education, and then they have internal political education around the important political texts of the time, including Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and Blackface, White Mask. They're also reading Marx and Engels and the works of Mao Zedong. And I think what is foundational to all of the young people of this period is that they're attempting to understand their society in order to transform it. They're learning for the purposes of understanding their relationship to their community, to the nation, and to the world. And so the profoundly existential question in education of the humanities, who am I, is being posed and answered in very dynamic ways that are immediately relevant to people, young people who want to change society. Part of what members of the organization, especially the women, say is that a lot of the young men who joined the organization, ages 15, 16, and 17, had dropped out of school at a pretty early age and couldn't read and write. And they learned how to do so in the organization. Then I found some photographs and commentaries and notes written by Evelina Antonetti, who was the leader and founder of United Bronx Parents, a Puerto Rican woman who organized paraprofessionals in the school system, like women, parents, right? Mothers, to get involved in the school around the issue of desegregation initially, but also decentralization later on. And in her instruction of these paraprofessionals, she shows them photographs of the young lords who are very young, having group discussions about the issue of the day: education, urban renewal, hunger, the crisis of health. And part of what she says is that our schools need to explore learning through peer education.
Thank you for that. I know Christina has another question, but I really appreciate what you said about recognizing what the humanities are meant to study and how the young lords were able to embody that and work with the community members. Thank you.
And I'll say something else about that, that ultimately the young lords successfully and effectively asked the question and answered, in this moment of uprising, who am I? Mm. And who do I want to be? Right? And that's a profound question about our relationship to authority and power and oppression and colonization. We could all answer that question. Who am I in relationship to authority? But who do I want to be is a completely different question that puts you in the center of your life as an agent for change, potentially, with an understanding sociologically of society's problems and your relationship to them.
Thank you.
Okay, well, as a lot of kids are starting to go back to school after COVID, and more parents are getting involved in what their kids are learning and who's running the school, we're seeing a lot of people wanting school safety taking out of the building because of their police training, and how okay is it for them to be disciplining their children while in school? How do you think the young lords would have reacted to this new sort of uprising against who is being put into the schools to protect our children?
Right. So the Young Lords were a self-proclaimed revolutionary nationalist and socialists who, like the Black Panthers, had a fierce critique of the police as an institution. And they believed that the police was there not to protect the community, but to uphold private property in a class divided society. And so the Young Lords, like the Black Panthers, popularized the term the pigs to describe the police. So they were fierce fighters against what they perceived was the expansion of police forces as early as the 1960s and early 1970s in communities of color, East Harlem. And part of what they argued was that the sudden rise of drugs in the community was engineered in many ways by those in power, and that they offered the presence of drugs, the proliferation of drugs, that's the word I'm looking, the proliferation of drugs became a vehicle through which to justify the police in communities of color and to keep these people in check and in their place. So they opposed the police, and in fact, they organized committees to intervene in community conflicts and to stop police from escalating conflicts in the community.
Yeah, I think that, we're seeing in so much, not necessarily a brand new call to defund police and invest in communities, but one that has a history that both the Black Panthers and the Young Lords were such a huge part of. Thinking about, the continuities between that, the calls for defunding the police and investing in communities, even if not in that language from the 1960s to now. Christina, you're in your freshman year of college, you've just graduated from high school where, you went to a school that had security at the door that checks everyone in. Not to mention, we can talk about the differences in curriculum or the similarities between what Dr. Fernandez described and what you experienced. But I'm curious, after this conversation and hearing more about this, what are you thinking about in terms of how we might reimagine schools or do them differently, using the Young Lords as maybe an example of an alternative way to think about education?
Well, with schools opening back up, I feel that they have to really look at what's being relayed in their students' lives and create school to be more of almost like a safe haven for them to express what they're really feeling, instead of, well, that's out there and this is something different. Because what you teach a child is like a sponge. They're going to soak it up. So if you're able to relay what's going on outside with racial issues and activism, and you put it into the schools and you start teaching more about it, kids are going to be more accepting to want to make change and know that if they continue, their voices have power to them, especially in schools where there are primarily white administrators and primarily white teachers teaching children of color, whether it be Asian, Black, Hispanic, whatever. Teachers have to be more sensitive to how they view things to how they need to teach these kids to take on this next role of activism that's going to be coming in to really fight for change in schools or even change in their daily lives. And they need to be more knowledgeable about the minority experience in America, especially in New York and in New York City public schools, where oppression is continuing to go on even in the 21st century. And so I think we're going to see a big change and a big influx of minority teachers coming in soon, and more people of color coming into a more of a leadership role in schools and changing what was before.
I think, can I respond to that? I think you're absolutely right. I think that a challenge for teachers in this period is to create curriculum, as you said, Christina, that reflects the world outside the window of the children in their classroom or the young people in their classroom. And part of what the Young Lords did when they occupied a church in East Harlem was that they created an ethnic studies class. They literally taught Black American history at the church and Puerto Rican history, but also current events to engage young people who were already interested in what was going on, because this was a moment of uprising and rebellion, to engage them in a deeper understanding of the problems of society. Right, so everyone who's young in this moment has experienced shock and awe from watching the way the president responded to the pandemic, to seeing George Floyd and Breonna Taylor killed by the police. Young people are confused about this. They have a sense of right and wrong, but these are confusing and traumatizing events. And if this classroom does not turn its attention to addressing these issues, the classroom itself will perpetuate the trauma that young people have lived and continue to live in this period.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights and perspectives. And I think something that continues that I'm thinking about after hearing both of you is, not just what is what the content is for a class, but how we engage with that content, especially Dr. Fernandez, what you were saying about peer-to-peer learning and allowing this to be a conversation rather than so top down. For those of you watching, please help us continue this conversation by sharing your ideas about reimagining education from today's episode with us on social media, and make sure to tune in as we continue to turn to the past to explore possible pathways forward. You've been watching The Reimaginers with Christina Martin, Johanna Fernandez, and myself, Matt Kautz. See you next time.